Thank you, Leon, and it's great to be with you all. This was my home chapter for a number of years, and I'm delighted to be back and to be a part of your program. This is the first audit conference that we've done with Washington chapter for government auditors in a number of years. So we're excited to be back and excited to be a part of the program today. This morning I'm going to share with you some reflections on a career in internal audit. Next year will mark 40 years for me in this profession, and the vast majority of my career was spent in government. And I was asked about 2 years ago by some of my colleagues with the IA Research Foundation if I might be interested in sharing some of my experiences in a way that would help internal auditors across the spectrum of their career, from entry level to heads of internal audits and government, in the government sector, even inspectors general, help them with some of the challenges that they might encounter by sharing some of my own experiences, some sort of life-based stories, if you will, from this profession of audit and government auditing and internal auditing. So this morning I would just say my purpose is to give you a quick overview of the stops that I made along the way, and then to share with you several key lessons that I've learned that I think you might find applicable in your own careers at some point. As some of you know, I started my career in the private sector, worked very briefly with a commercial bank before joining the GAO. I was over at the GAO headquarters yesterday to meet with the Controller General, and walking in there was very nostalgic because it was almost 38 years ago when I first walked the halls of the GAO as a young trainee there in the offices on G Street. I didn't spend very long with GAO. Then I moved over to the Army and served in the Army's civilian internal audit program, the internal review program, where I spent really a sizable chunk of my career. And I moved back down from Washington, where I'd come to start my career, moved back to Atlanta, and I spent the next 17 years moving up the ranks in the internal review organization at Headquarters Forces Command, which was based in Atlanta at that time. Over the course of those years, I had an opportunity to serve at every level, from what we called at that time auditor intern, which was a trainee, right up to the chief of internal review at FORSCOM, which was a 4-star command, and I'll share a couple of my experiences from those years with you over the course of our time together this morning. After 17 years there in Atlanta, I decided that I wanted to try my hand at work here in Washington again. So I moved my family back here, and I joined the Pentagon, where I was the director of internal review for the Army. Had at that time almost 1,400 auditors based in 300 locations around the world that I helped to provide some oversight for. Those were very exciting years, very challenging years, because they were immediately after the downsizing following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the so-called peace dividend that was being sought from the Department of Defense. So a lot of pressures from a budget standpoint. After 4 years at the Pentagon, then I moved over to right up the street here to the U.S. Postal Service's Inspector General office. They were in the process of setting that office up. Postal IG had not had an office historically. Congress mandated a new Inspector General organization there in the mid-1990s, so I moved up there to help the IG who was putting that organization together, and spent the next 3 years as part of the Postal IG organization, becoming the first deputy IG for the Postal Service. Then I moved down, as I'll talk about later, moved down to Knoxville, where I served as the Inspector General of the Tennesse Valley Authority. And following turn of events regarding the IG Act and the reclassification of that position to a presidential appointee, I took an early retirement and went to the IIA, and have been with the Institute of Internal Auditors twice over the last 14 years, and in the middle I spent about 5 years as the national practice leader for PricewaterhouseCoopers over their internal audit advisory services. So over the course of my years, I've had an opportunity to work in internal audit and IG work within government. I've had a chance to work in the not-for-profit sector, and I've also had a chance to work in the corporate sector via one of the big 4 accounting firms. So overall, it's been an exciting career, and I think I've picked up more than a few anecdotes along the way that some of you will find relevant here this morning. So with that, let me share with you some of the things that I've learned that I think, regardless of where you are in your career, you either have encountered or you're going to likely encounter, the lessons that auditors in government invariably have to address. The first one is really that stakeholders judge our value. Internal auditors and government auditors definitely have stakeholders. It took me a while to figure that out. As a young auditor, I assumed that we were there because there was an Army regulation that said that we should be there. Audit activities were supposed to be organized in every command around the world. This internal review program that had been in place since the end of World War II. I didn't have any question that we had a place to be because the regulations mandated it. It really wasn't until I became the director of internal review for the Army right after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. And there was a lot of pressure on downsizing within the military. There was an expectation that we were going to save some money for the taxpayers. And what I discovered immediately on assuming the role of the Director of Internal Review at the Pentagon was that our resources out there around the world were being dramatically downsized, more dramatically than the Army's budget. In some places, we were seeing our internal audit departments cut by 75% or more. Certainly the budgets in the military were being reduced, but not by that much. So I spent about 6 weeks, right after I got here to Washington and joined the staff down at the Pentagon, I spent about 6 weeks traveling around the world and talking to military commanders, to other military officers, and to others within Army activities around the world about what was it that internal review was not delivering that really caused them to make these very difficult decisions to reduce the staffing. And I heard a lot, and I learned a lot, and it was probably the most rewarding experience from a learning standpoint that I had encountered up to that point in my career. What I heard was stakeholders, those who relied on internal audit's work, making very difficult assessments of the value that they were getting. I would hear Army commanders say, I know how important it is to have an internal audit function. I understand the value that they can provide me, but at this time, I have to make very difficult decisions. I either have to spend money on, I either have money that I have to spend on family housing for my soldiers or audit. And I don't think that it's a choice for me. I felt like that was a false choice because I thought what they were really doing was, as one of the Army generals later coined it, they were eating their seed corn. Because if you get rid of your audit capability at a time when you've got to figure out how to reduce your resources, you've taken away the very people who are going to be there to help you do that. So I heard other stories as well. I'd hear commanders say, the audits take too long. I need somebody who can come in here and tell me what time it is, and by the time I get an audit report, they're telling me how to fix the watch. I heard them talk about that the auditors were not focused on the real issues and challenges. I heard them talk about the fact that they needed quick decisions or quick information or speedy information for decision making. So I came back with a really keen understanding that the decisions that were being made by those who were making the investment in audit was that they were having to make that assessment based on what they judged the value of the function to be. And it really helped us to formulate our own strategies over at the Pentagon for how we were going to re-engineer our internal review organization at the time. Today, when we think about stakeholders in the corporate sector or even in government, we're often talking about audit committees who represent the board in their interaction with internal audit. We're talking about executive management. If I'm in the IG community, I'm certainly speaking about the executive management of my agency, but I'm also speaking about, in the IG community, for example, I'm also speaking about Congress and the fact that I have these competing, or not competing always, but these dual reporting relationships. We're speaking about operating management within our organizations and within our agencies. And we're also speaking about citizens and taxpayers and others. So we have a vast portfolio of stakeholders with whom we have to interact and have to address. Some of the common stakeholder concerns that we hear, and this is true whether we're speaking about government or we're speaking about